today we will be discussing about a new event which took place, in April 2023, with the launch by the European Commission of its proposal for a SEP regulation, and which proposal was recently adopted with a few amendments by the European Parliament. So we have this first step in the European legislative process, and we have this draft regulation, which undoubtedly will have really important consequences on the SEP market. Do you have, maybe, Eric, some views on it?
Yeah, I do. Thanks. First, bonjour, Cyril, and thank you for inviting me back to talk about the SEP regulation and FrandAvenue. Yeah, there's a lot to discuss about that, the Commission's proposal for an SEP regulation, and what motivated the amendments that were offered by the Legal Affairs Committee. But the vote in the Parliament, 454 to 85, suggests to me that something is going to emerge from the Council. I know that there's a few steps in the legislative process left, but it seems to me, not being an expert on these things, it seems to me something is going to come out of the Council, and that there will be a new law in the EU regulating the licensing of SEPs to at least some extent. So since the vote in the Parliament, I've put myself back in my chair when I was working at Ericsson. And I think, what would I do if I'm at Ericsson? If I'm one of the major SEP holders, what do I do now? What should I be preparing for? What can I do? And that question has been bouncing around in my head now for 2 weeks. I'd like to get your thought on that. What would you do if you were, for example, in my old job at Ericsson today? What would you be preparing for?
And that's a good question, because certainly people can't simply bury their head in the sand and say, well, that will not happen. I don't want it to happen, and this will not happen, because this is launched. What will be the real and complete outcome of this legislative process, that remains to be seen. But I think that one thing is for sure, this disclosure obligations, the registrar part of this regulation, the obligations that the draft regulation has put on paper now in a very detailed manner about what sort of information should be recorded and made available, that will remain. So knowing that, how, if I were a licensor, for example, how would I prepare? But I think implementers also need to be prepared for. That's for sure.
Let me ask you a question. How does the information required by this new EU IPO register differ from the information that's already being provided to the ETSI IPR database?
Well, certainly to a large extent, they are similar. When you take all the entries of this register, you should in fact mirror the ETSI database, or in fact import the ETSI database into this register, provided that this ETSI database would first be completed, because many patent holders do not fill in all the fields and all the necessary information in the ETSI database today. But I would say that, generally speaking, everything that is today in the ETSI database should be and will be in the EU registrar, plus much more information, such as the aggregate royalty rates, such as information about the license agreements. That's another category of information, I would say commercial information, for which we don't know yet how the regulation will deal with that category of information. But at least for technical information, that is there.
But with regard to the basic information, it will be similar to what's already in the Etsy IPR database, or will there be a lot of work in order to provide that basic information that's required by the regulation?
There will be a lot of work. That's clear. For example, if you take the information disclosure about the specification, the specific section within the technical specification, the patent holders under the current Etsy rules are invited to fill that field and explain which subsection of the technical specification is covered by the claims of the declared patents.
And very few companies do that.
Very few companies. We have that information available. We will publish rankings soon, but clearly not everyone has a similar practice at Etsy level. So just to prepare, and that information will be made mandatory in the EU register, to give you an example.
Okay.
And
so that's a lot of work.
It is.
It's not providing a claim chart, but it's in the direction of providing more information as would be found on a claim chart. So that's a lot of work, especially if you're talking tens of thousands of patents.
Absolutely. And of course, this is just one example, but you have other examples.
And let me ask, what do you see as the downside of not doing that?
Well, that's very simple. This is there, and now for people who have a licensing program, who are trying to value their IP with brand license agreements, you can see that today they have these deals made on a global basis, of course, including Europe. And that will continue, obviously. They will need to keep licensing their patents in the EU, which is a very large market. Now, if they do not comply with the new regulation, that will be impossible because they will simply be barred from licensing their patents if they have not satisfied to their obligations with respect to the registrar. So if information is missing, they will not be able to license their patents out. As simple as that.
Okay, so it's actually the consequences are pretty substantial for not being prepared to do this. Okay, and I mean we say regulation, but when the regulation becomes European law, then it's European law. It'll be French law. It'll be German law. It'll be a legal requirement everywhere. Right. Okay. Okay.
Absolutely.
Can you give me some examples of the information that's required by the regulation, and how FrandAvenue, how the platform is able to accommodate those fields, those information
with
fields?
Pleasure. Let me share my screen because we have listed all. I think you can see it now.
If you could make it larger for me, it would be helpful. In the bottom right, just zoom it in.
Yes.
Perfect. Good. Okay. Thank you. I know what to put my reading glasses on now.
Sorry about that. So we have listed, there are many information that needs to be given to the competence center. But if you look simply at Articles 4 and 5 of this draft regulation, you can see what are the minimal requirements, all the fields which will need to be filled in this registrar for essential patents, which is created at Article 4 of the regulation. And you can, it would be too long to take you through all of that, but you can see that there will be a register I just mentioned that our register at FrandAvenue is up and live since 2011, 21, sorry.
An interesting thing I just observed, sir, I'll ask you about briefly. I see that information on relevant standards, 4.3,
Yes.
you have ETSI, 3GPP, IEEE, ANSI, IEC. Those are not all just European standards.
No.
ANSI is obviously, there are American standards. So does this regulation even apply to non-European standards?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this information that's available on the ETSI IPR database isn't available at all for some of the other standards. I don't think ITU maintains a database for the HEVC standards like ETSI has for 3GPP. So it's not just complementing the information, but it's creating new information as well.
It is creating new information.
Okay.
And that's a very important factor. Obviously, the 3GPP standards represent the bulk of the problem. And we have this ETSI database. And this is, of course, very important, but other standards, and a few are mentioned here. Those which are mentioned here are those which we have on FrandAvenue. But there are many more to come.
Right.
Because the regulation provides that if you cannot basically assert a patent in Europe, claiming that it is essential to a given standard, whatever the standard, if you haven't already filled in and declared your patent on this register. So if you don't comply with that, you can't assert your patent based on an essentiality reasoning.
And you can't either collect royalties on it. Is that correct? If I remember reading the regulation. Right. Okay. Okay. So this is sort of the bare minimum requirement of entry. If I want to continue to license my patents in Europe, I'm going to need to provide this information to the register or to another platform that will provide the same function.
Absolutely.
Because I have to say, I'm a little skeptical that the EU IPO is going to get a register up and running in a very short period of time. I think this is one of these major software projects that typically run over budget and over time. So I would be concerned that I would be delayed by the delays in Alicante.
You are absolutely right. It's difficult. I know it because we've done it over the past years. So I know that it's a complex exercise. It's not that trivial at all. But what I know as well is this. Even if it takes months or years for this regulation to become enacted, this will apply. This is now out there. And actors know that under the new EU regulation, there will be no possibility of licensing a portfolio if the portfolio owner has not provided all the information that we can see on the screen. And I believe that this will impact the negotiation immediately. From now, those negotiations will be impacted because implementers will want to see all that information in order to make a decision. And by the way, when you look at the categories of information which are required, you can quickly see that, in fact, well, that's the basic information that everyone should give when licensing a portfolio. There are other categories of information that implementers should provide as well, but that's another story for another podcast, probably.